Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Peter Dillard, and I would like to welcome you to the second installment in my series of video lectures on ideas in Wittgenstein's Tractatus. These are introductory videos that are intended to help those who are interested in reading and understanding Wittgenstein's work better to have success at that. So today, what I want to do is talk about Wittgenstein's picture theory of meaning in the Tractatus. Last time I had something to say about Wittgenstein's view of logic in that work. But today I want to talk about the picture theory of meaning. Now, the motivation for this theory is the question of how does language relate to the world? How is it that language is about the world? How does language represent facts, objects and facts in the world? Wittgenstein is very exercised or motivated by this question, and the picture theory is supposed to be an answer to it. It's supposed to give a viable answer to that question. One way to begin to understand the picture theory is to consider a very different view that Bertrand Russell held around the time he was collaborating with Wittgenstein at Cambridge, before Wittgenstein left Cambridge and went to Norway to work on the Tractatus. This is a view that Russell held about how thought relates to reality, what the nature of thought, certain kinds of thoughts, and by extension language, that Wittgenstein found unsatisfactory, and for good reason. So part of this dissatisfaction led Wittgenstein towards the picture theory. That was one motivation. Now, what was Russell's view? Very briefly, it was something like this. Let's consider the thought that the following thought. Othello believes that Desdemona loves Iago, and this leads Othello to be very jealous and eventually to kill Desdemona, as what happens in the play. So Russell analyzes this thought as a relation between Othello and a certain complex consisting of Desdemona, the relation of loving, and Iago. And so when Othello stands in this relation of believing or be to the complex I just described, then and only then Othello believes that Desdemona loves Iago. Now immediately a problem arises because there's another belief that is consistent with all of what I just said, which is, Othello could stand in this relation to the complex, but it could also be that Othello believes not that Desdemona loves Iago, but that Iago loves Desdemona, which might lead him to do very different things and to react in very different ways. And in the case of both of those beliefs, the same relationship obtains between Othello on the one hand and the complex consisting of Desdemona loving and Iago on the other. Now, Russell goes through all kinds of contortions to try to overcome this problem, none of which are really satisfactory, and certainly Wittgenstein didn't find any of that satisfactory. So this was one thing that led him to abandon Russell's view, which makes use, notice, of abstractor-like relations, something that Wittgenstein is going to eschew. That was one motivation that led Wittgenstein away from Russell toward the picture theory. But another very interesting one, and this is a very interesting story, is that Wittgenstein was impressed by the way miniature models were used at the time in traffic courts to represent the relations among vehicles at an accident scene. So we can imagine one of these models. Let's say there's a yellow block that stands for the yellow car, and there's a red block that stands for the red car, and then there's a blue block that stands for the blue truck. And so when the yellow block is to the left of the red block and the red block is to the left of the blue block, that represents the following configuration among the vehicles at the accident scene, where the yellow car is to the left of the red car, and the red car is to the left of the blue truck. So that the spatial configurations among the blocks mirror the spatial configuration of the vehicles at the accident scene. And Wittgenstein is very impressed by this, to the point that he wants to say that in the case of declarative sentences that purport to express facts, he wants to say that the syntactic relations among the expressions in the declarative sentence stand in a certain kind of, if not exactly isomorphism, but in a certain kind of systematic relationship to the configuration of the objects in the fact. There's a kind of isomorphism there, which I want to be a little more specific about now. So let's take an example. What kind is that? Let's suppose that we talk about, well, A, let's, in sort of somewhat abstract terms, A is to the right of B. Object A is to the right of B. Now, let's just consider that propositional sign. So that purports to express the fact that A is to the right of B. So for Wittgenstein, there are two kinds of rules that pertain to that sentence, A is to the right of B, A-R-B. There are two kinds of rules. One set of rules are the rules of denotation. And so these are the rules that pair names with objects. So like A, the expression A names the object A, and the expression B names the object B. There's no relation though. Like R doesn't name anything. So he does away with relations, which is something that was central, remember, to Russell's view. So on the one hand, there are rules of denotation. On the other hand, there are rules of projection. And these are the rules that articulate the sort of isomorphism between the syntactic relationships among the expressions in the sentence and the configurations among the objects and the facts. So just to put this very briefly, we might say, well, here's ARB. And then we could break that down a little bit more and say, well, A, the expression A, right, left flanks the expression B. That means something like, well, when the expression A is concatenated with R, that and make right, so that concatenation, and then that entire concatenation is flanks B, or is put to the left of B. That whole thing says that A is to the right of B. So notice that the syntactic relation between A and B, where A left flanks B in the sentence, that is A concatenated with R, or concatenated with is to the right of, that series, that expression stands to the left of B. That syntactic structure mirrors the structure in the world, or in the possible fact, where A is to the right of B. Right? So in this case, we could say that the proposition is a picture of the possible fact, or a model. In some ways, model is a better term. So that the syntactic relations among the expressions in the sentence models the relations among the objects in the possible fact, which could actually obtain or not. And if it does, the sentence is true, and if it doesn't, the sentence is false. Or take another example. C, O, D. Suppose that means something like, well, C is on D. And so once again, here's the syntactic configuration in the sentence. So the expression C concatenated on left flanks D, which means the expression C concatenated with O, or is on, that stands to the left of D. All right? And that syntactic configuration mirrors the configuration in the possible fact where C is on top of D. So once again, the syntactic relations in the declarative sentence model the relations among that are the configuration of objects in the fact or in the possible fact. Now, I want to conclude, and that should give you a basic idea of what Wittgenstein thinks when he says, well, that sentences are models of reality or possible facts. And notice that none of this makes any use of relations or abstracta. All we have are objects that are configured together into facts. On the one hand, that's the world part. And then on the other hand, we have sentences that are in which the expressions stand in a particular syntactic configuration. And again, there are two kinds of rules that pertain to these sentences that enable them to express possible facts. One are the rules of designation, or the rules of denotation, which pair proper names with objects in the fact or in the possible fact. And then the other are the rules of projection, which set up how the syntactic relations in the sentence are supposed to mirror or be isomorphic to the configuration among the objects in the possible fact. So this is the gist of Wittgenstein's picture theory. Now, I want to conclude by just saying there are a couple of problems with this, or things that Wittgenstein never really worked out, and this led him eventually to abandon the picture theory in his later works. And I want to mention two general areas in which Wittgenstein felt dissatisfied with the picture theory, and these were possible motivations that led him to abandon it in his later work. One is that, given all what I just said about the rules of denotation and the rules of projection, we can construct sentences that can't represent anything. In other words, the possible fact that they purport to represent is absolutely impossible. And there's a dissimilarity between this situation in connection with sentences and the situation with the colored blocks in the car model. If I try to represent the yellow car as being to the right of the blue car, of the red car, and the red car as being to the right of the blue truck, and then once again the yellow car is also being to the right of the blue truck, I can't do that with the blocks. I can't set up that possible model, or that I can't set up that model of that possible configuration. It's simply impossible for me to put the blocks together in any kind of spatial configuration that would, undermine or reject the transitivity of the to the right of relationship. Can't do it. Now, that's not the case in language, though. Just to take a very brief example, we could say something like, well, C is on D, and D is on E, and E is on C. Come back around to it, right? We could certainly construct a sentence like that. Unlike the case of the blocks, we can't do that with the colored blocks. We can't really put together a possible configuration like that, but we can do it here. And we could, I won't go into all the details, but we could run the same kind of analysis in terms of rules of designation and also rules of projection, to unpack that, the various syntactic configurations among the names in the sentence that denote the objects in the possible fact. And we would be forced to say, if we did that, well, that means that would represent the possible fact that C is on D, and D is on E, and E is on C. But that's not a possible fact. That's impossible. Sinnlos in German again. That can't be. Now, what Wittgenstein takes this to show is that this sentence and the kind of quasi-syntactic analysis that I gave of it, there must be some way of analyzing this original sentence away into some more primitive sentence or conjunction of sentences where this kind of we can't come up with this kind of configuration. In other words, there must be some logical analysis of the original sentence where we simply come up with names concatenated with certain other kinds of expressions that don't allow us, to come up with, ways of concatenating the names that represent impossible states of affairs. And this is Wittgenstein's notion of a logical analysis. Now, he's notoriously obscure or vague about what that is. How do you know what would an analysis, a complete logical analysis of an ordinary language proposition like this or any other one look like? We don't really know. He never really gives us any specific examples of what a complete logical analysis of an ordinary language sentence would look like. With the possible exception that he does think that Russell's theory of definite descriptions works for sentences that contain definite descriptions in a way of paraphrasing them away in terms of quantifiers and the truth functional connectors, but I don't want to get into that right now. That's a whole other kettle of fish. The point is that when it comes to this kind of problem, Wittgenstein doesn't really show how we can break even, a sentence like this down in a way that we come to a kind of sentence where we can't, just like in the case of the model for the cars in the accident scene, we can't literally construct a model where the yellow car is to the left of the red car and the red car is to the left of the blue bus, and the yellow car is also, but then the yellow car is to the right of the blue bus or the blue truck or whatever. We can't do that because it's simply impossible. Wittgenstein never shows us how to break sentences down to a level where we're dealing with sentences where that can never happen. He just doesn't do it. Another area of controversy or unclarity, or at least something that leads Wittgenstein away from the view of Tractatus, especially in his later work, and this is on a more positive level, something I want to talk about next time. And that is that, notice we've been talking about rules. We've talked about the rules of designation that pair the names, the proper names in sentences with objects and possible facts, and then we've talked about the rules of projection that articulate the way the syntactic configuration in the sentence among the names and the other expressions of the sentence stands in a certain mirroring relation or isomorphism to the configuration among the objects and the possible facts that's expressed by the sentence or asserted by the sentence. Wittgenstein becomes, in other words, rules are sort of being taken for granted here. But what is a rule, or what is it to follow a rule correctly? And what does rule following consist, or what are there are certain philosophical puzzles that people might have about rules, and where do we look in order to understand what rules are, in order to avoid these kinds of philosophical puzzles? Where is it in our everyday language and everyday practice that we get a purchase on what it is to follow a rule? Because Wittgenstein here is simply taking it for granted that we know what that is, and philosophers might say, well, there's a problem with that. We'll look at some of this material later in the next video lecture when we turn to some of what Wittgenstein has to say in the philosophical investigations, the philosophische Untersuchungen. But that's all I wanted to say for now. I hope that will give you a fairly clear idea of what Wittgenstein is doing, at least initially, with the picture theory in the Tractatus. So if anybody has any questions about that, please feel free to put them in the feed under this YouTube video. But until next time, thank you for joining me. I hope that has provided some degree of clarification of these issues. Until next time, this is Dr. Peter Dillard. Thank you again for joining me.